Welcome everyone to the third session in today's research breakout room. My name is Jennifer Jones and I am the research agronomist with the Illinois Soybean Association. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute just to thank this session's sponsor, Benson Hill. Let's give them a round of applause for their support of Soybean Summit. Thank you. Thank you, Benson Hill. All right, originally this session was going to be led by Dr. Aaron Hager. However, he is unable to attend today due to sickness. So we have Corey Lacey instead, our wonderful colleague at the Illinois Soybean Association. He is a regulatory public policy manager, and he has graciously offered to step in and discuss the Endangered Species Act and proposed changes to herbicide labels. So Dr. Lacey focuses his time advocating for Illinois soybean farmers on conservation and environmental policy issues. He holds degrees in environmental soil and water science, agriculture science, and soil fertility and conservation. Prior to working at ISA, he managed an agricultural testing laboratory based in central Illinois. Additionally, he has over a decade of agronomic experience working with Illinois growers. So before Dr. Lacey comes up, just as a reminder, if you have questions at the end during the Q&A period, please use the microphones, or we'll have Corey repeat your questions so that those online can hear as well. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Lacey.
All right, so thank you everybody for coming and letting me talk to you today. I know you were expecting Dr. Haggard, and you're going to be disappointed by me, I'm sure, because he's a much more intelligent man than me, but hopefully I can get at some stuff. This is a research session, but we're going to talk a lot about policy today, and I think that that's an exciting thing. That's something we should be talking about more about. So, title, Navigating a New Era, Understanding the Endangered Species Act and its Impacts on Pesticide Regulation. So just to get a couple things out of the way, first off, as it's been pointed out, I'm not Dr. Aaron Haggard. The reason that that's up there is I've given this presentation a couple times now. These slides are actually some that he put together, but I like to give him credit for putting together the slides, but just be specific in what I talk about today is either my position or Illinois Soybeans' position. The other thing I want to highlight is we're going to talk about policy issues from a very almost theoretical space, from a proposed, everything we're talking about is mostly proposed. And so why I highlight that is it's all subject to change. And we all know things are subject to change anyway, but it's important to start with that position. These are things the Environmental Protection Agency has told us they're thinking about doing. None of it's been finalized. The last thing I want to just kind of highlight before we move is that we're dealing with a complicated issue. It's a space where environmental policy, agriculture policy, political issues and political priorities, and science all intermingle. And so that makes it very complex. And so I will tell you my perspective, my interpretation, but just everyone's on the same page. I'm not a perfect person. I could have something wrong, and I'm happy to discuss that. So when I think about the herbicide strategy, and I'll just start off, who in the room has heard about the herbicide strategy? Okay, one or two people. You're going to start hearing about it even more. Who in the room has heard about the Endangered Species Act? Okay, and everyone knows who the Environmental Protection Agency is, right? Okay. When I first started looking at this, and this has been over a year now of kind of thinking about it, the thing I had to keep reminding myself is that there are some really, I believe, well-intentioned people in DC who have said there's an issue we have to address, and they feel like they've come up with a simple plan. And I thought about this comic that actually my son shared with me, but our simple plan, and then you look at that, it's not simple. And when we deal with the Endangered Species Act labeling and pesticide regulation space, that's exactly what we're facing. We have people who have created policy that feel like they've come up with a very simple plan that's not simple. The herbicide strategy is an example. It's a 900-page document that's going to affect all herbicide use across the country for every farmer. So there's no way that could be simple, but that's the perspective that we get from DC. And so I think that that's just an important thought pattern. So why do I say it's not simple? First, and I'm going to just kind of interweave this thought throughout the talk, But there's more added layers of complexity. So the kind of thesis of the talk is how agricultural pesticides are used in Illinois will become more complex. So what does that complexity look like? We're going to see increased complexity on our labels, okay? How many of you have heard of Bulletin's Live 2? Anybody? Okay, so if you want to know what your pesticide label looks like right now, what do you do? What do you look at? The bottle, right? Okay. Moving forward, those labels are going to change. We're going to see dynamic elements of those labels. So instead of what we usually consider as a very static process, we're going to have an online portion of the label where we have to get online or on our cell phones and check and see, has the label changed? We're going to see an example later in this talk of where that label has changed from year to year. So I want you to think about the relevance of that. If where I can and can't use pesticides and how I can use them changes year to year, that really adds complexity. And what that also adds is this thought process of we have to increase the amount of record keeping. And I don't have a solution for that, but I will say that that's some space that farmers need to start thinking about. How are we record keeping better? How are we proving that we did things correctly? How are we proving that we're following the rules? The other area of complication is, or complexity, I guess, is regulation. So where that's going to increase is, there's a couple areas where that will increase, but the one I like to highlight is your location of your field. So what we're going to see moving forward is that where we can and can't do things with pesticides is going to depend on whether or not that field is in the range or the county where an endangered species is present, okay? So, or where it's thought to be present. And so what that means for us is that a field in one part of a county, you may have different rules than a field in another county, part of the county, even if it's just a mile down the road, okay? So again, there's this added complexity of thought. And then possibly my biggest, I hesitate to say biggest because as we get into this, there will be a lot of things that are my biggest concern. But one of the biggest concerns is the complexity of misuse investigations. So I think we all are very aware that there are pesticide misuse investigations that happen now. A lot of times they're around drift. Did I spray and hit a neighbor's tree? Something like that. When we enter this Endangered Species Act part of this equation, all of a sudden we're opening up a whole new space for both civil and criminal lawsuits to occur, but also for a whole new set of rules that we have to follow to make sure that we're in compliance. And the level and intensity of that is going to go way up over the next few years. And my concern there is, A, we don't know how that's going to be enforced. We assume that IDOA will be the enforcing body because that would make the most sense. But I would question, is IDOA equipped to monitor pesticide use on every state or every field in the state on that level? And we also see, and we'll talk about this more, there's a lot of engagement from environmental groups on this, on the other side. And there's a lot of concern about, are we going to see environmental groups intentionally monitoring farmers so that they can capture an accidental misuse and bring a civil case about that to try to pressure people to continue this concept. So we don't know where the protections are. We also don't know where the responsibility lies. Right now, I don't know, it's unclear if the commercial applicator is responsible, if the farmer would be responsible, if the landowner is responsible. There's just a lot of questions there. So I'm just giving you these things to say there's levels of complexity that are going to increase. We're going to dive into some of this, but this is why I'm concerned. This is why I want you to be listening to this. So if we step back, I think we have to ask ourselves, what's driving these changes? And so, any guesses what's driving the changes? I maybe hinted at it. Ron? Yeah. Environmental protection, Ron said lawsuits, and we're going to get to that because that's absolutely true. The key aspect of what's driving this is the EPA and the Endangered Species Act. And I think that makes us have to ask ourselves, what's the role of the US EPA in pesticide regulation, and how does Endangered Species Act play into that? So I'm going to break it down. When it comes to pesticide policy in the US, there's two bills that you have to know. There's FIFRA, Who knows what FIFRA is? Anybody? Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Okay, what's important to know about FIFRA is it was written with the express intent of regulating pesticides. It gave the EPA authority to regulate pesticides in the U.S. What is good about FIFRA, and I think a lot of us, BASF is in the room, they maybe differ, but one thing we can agree on is that FIFRA, in a lot of ways, has worked for farmers. It's worked for agriculture for 50 years, since 1972. It hasn't been perfect, but it's been a solution we can work with. And the reason is because that's a risk-benefit statute. And I'll just read the language on here. Any unreasonable risk to man or the environment, taking into account the economic, social, and environmental costs and benefits of the use of a pesticide. So, if you leave here knowing anything about FIFRA, I want you to understand that it's a risk-benefit statute that allows for that assessment of what's the value of the pesticide, not just the concern about the damage. Now, the other piece of legislation that's now entering this space is the Endangered Species Act. And I want you to look at this slide. So 1972 was FIFRA. When was ESA established, according to the slide? Was it a long time later? 1973. So it's been in place for 50 years, okay? That's key. We're going to be talking about this, but this is not new legislation. That's an important thing to bring up. What the Endangered Species Act does is it's very distinct from FIFRA because it's a, how do I want to say it? It's a thou shall not statute. It says that any federal agency shall not endanger or negatively impact a protected species or its environment, or the actual language is habitat. And that's important. It's not just about we can't go and accidentally kill a protected species, we also can't damage the environment where it might live. And the difference there, right, is there's not as much wiggle room in that. There's not flexibility for agriculture to say, well, what about the economic benefits? What about the feeding the world benefits? It's just you can't do it. Another thing that I think is important, because in agriculture we think of ESA as very ag-focused, but it actually applies to all federal agencies. Department of Defense, DOE, everybody has to comply with Endangered Species Act. And that's important because it was not written with the intent of regulating pesticides. It was written with the intent of protecting endangered species. And those are two different goals. And it's important to understand that distinction. So just diving a little bit deeper here, the Endangered Species Act says that any federal agency cannot jeopardize the continued existence of any listed species or destroy or adversely modify any critical habitat of those species. So why do we care about that when it comes to pesticides? The reason we care about that is because the EPA under FIFRA has the responsibility to register pesticides for use in the U.S. Every time they register a pesticide for use in the U.S., that's an official agency action that has to be in compliance with Endangered Species Act. Okay? So why am I concerned? Is my corn and soybean field a habitat for an endangered species? Do you guys feel like there's endangered species in your corn and soybeans fields? It's not a natural habitat for sure. But whenever we apply a pesticide, and we know this, whether it's a few feet or a mile, there is a footprint, an ecological footprint around that pesticide application where it leaves our fields. We've talked about this with years for nutrient loss reduction strategy issues, but that's the concern here, that footprint, that pesticide leaving the field that has been allowed by the agency action could hurt an endangered species. And that's where that's the violation of the Endangered Species Act that they're concerned about. So it's a little bit of a nuance, but I want to make sure we're tracking through that. So I highlighted that FIFRA 1972, ESA 1973, it's been 50 years. Why are we talking about this now? Ron, you said it earlier. Why are we talking about it now? Lawsuits? Okay. We're going to get there. I would argue that why we're talking about this now broadly is because the regulatory landscape in the U.S. has changed. And one real highlight of that is, this is Jake Lee, who is the Assistant Deputy Director of the US EPA Pesticide Program. And at the Weed Science Society of America in 2023, he came on board and said that, and there's a lot there, you can read this whole thing, but what I want to highlight here is the agency had registered and re-registered pesticides without going through the ESA process for decades. So this is the agency admitting that they have not met their obligations. Okay? And that concedes, that is the pinnacle, or the key signal to me that there's been a major regulatory change in the landscape. What does that mean for us? First, it means that the EPA has admitted that they're not doing it. Why they've admitted that is because of continued litigation. What that means for new active ingredients is that we're going to see ESA policy labels on all new active ingredients. That's a order that's come down through the EPA right now. So anything new is going to have ESA labels. It means that we're going to see litigation and court action. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to pretend like I am. But we have seen clear evidence that the courts can stop pesticide use. They have the authority under our government to say, EPA didn't do their job, so we're going to pull that registration, and we're not going to be allowed to use it. It means that when pesticides come up for re-registration under EPA, which is every 7 to 10 years, an ESA label is going to be applied to them. And also, one thing I would really like to, I guess, characterize about this situation, this landscape, is that we want to think of it as a science-based approach. I think as agronomists, as farmers, we want to believe that things are science-based. And traditionally they have been. But what we're seeing now is that there's policy impacts, but there's also political things at play here. And I'm not going to surprise you with that statement. I think we all in the room understand that politics plays a role in our lives. But I am going to illustrate something that I think helps us understand that a little bit better. So this is an executive order issued in January of 2021. And I'm just going to highlight some language in that. So it's just blown up. But basically it said, it was Biden saying we need to work on our federal policy around protecting the environment. But some of the language in there, I'm just going to read this to you. The heads of all agencies shall immediately review the existing regulations, guidance, policy, and actions issued and adopted between January 20th, 2017 and January 20th of 2021. They didn't say over the last decade. They didn't say in recent years. They're all currently active. They said those 2 dates. Who was president during that time period? Trump. And who is president now? Not Trump. That may change in a few months, I don't know, but right now he's not. So I'm not saying that this is good or bad or that politics shouldn't play a role in our conversations. I work for government relations. I would argue that politics should play a role in good public policy. But I think that this is a clear example of where politics have played a role in a way that impacts us on the farm level. And I just think it's important that we understand that. I'll let you guys think about whatever you want to think about there. So before we move any farther, I kind of want to, let's deep dive into the Endangered Species Act. So I want to talk about the structure of the Endangered Species Act. And I'll just caveat this with, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legalese person, but when I dig into this, when I talk to other people, I think the ESA was structured in a way that was intentionally designed to be burdensome and to be ripe for litigation. And I think we see evidence of that in our, and just in the public naturally. We see lots of examples of ESA lawsuits. I would argue that it was probably intentional. There's language in there that I've at least been told what it basically does is it makes it very easy for the individual citizen to bring a lawsuit against the federal government. And again, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's an element that's built into the Endangered Species Act. Why we care about that is because what's happened to that, I think probably well-intentioned initial language, is it's been co-opted by anti-pesticide, anti-GMO groups as a tool to go after us as an industry. And I think that's important to remember. I think there are a lot of good-natured people, not good-natured, well-intended people who really, really want to make sure that we are protecting endangered species. But I think there are other people who are more driven by, we want to get rid of pesticides, we want to change the way we're doing agriculture in the country, and they're using ESA as a tool to get there. And the reason I highlight that is because I think it's important for us to understand it's not necessary, this whole discussion is not about the facts, it's about the remedy, it's about the underlying intents of the motivating of the groups, okay? And the reason I say that is because I know of no example where an endangered species has gone extinct due to pesticide use in the US. There's really not a good example of that. So it's not about the facts. These things haven't happened. It's about, okay, this is something we're scared of, we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to use that as a way to motivate public policy so that we limit pesticide use. And I would argue some groups want to eliminate pesticide use. You know, that's a whole different conversation. And I think some illustrations of that, you know, I won't read that whole paragraph down there, but the EPA is under a lot of lawsuits on this issue, dozens at any given time. So this is important to understand. The motivator here is the EPA is being sued by the other side. Not by us, but by the other side. So what does the Endangered Species Act do? You know, we see a lot of numbers. When actually Dr. Hager made this slide in 2022, there were 1,600 species on the listed. 895 had critical habitats that were protected. What I want to highlight here, the biggest group is plants. When we think about pesticides in plants, what are we thinking about? What pesticide are we thinking about? Roundup, herbicides in general, right? Here's the first thing that came to my mind. Glyphosate. Glyphosate is up for re-registration in a few years. It is, the reason that it works so well is because it's good at killing plants. Am I wrong? Right? That's why it does its job. It's also likely going to be good at killing the protected species that we're talking about. And so what that means is, if we're following the train of thought here, we're looking at a lot of regulation on things like glyphosate. I think that's something we need to think about. Because how many people in the room use glyphosate on their operations? Okay. I saw one person not raise their hand. I won't call them out about it. But I think, just to be fair, right? And also, I think we should recognize glyphosate is really commonly used in the urban sector too, right? You go down to Lowe's and buy glyphosate for your house. None of the regulation we're talking about impacts urban use at all. We're only talking about agriculture. So what are the challenges? First, I mentioned it multiple times, there are court rulings. We can go into the details of the court ruling, but basically, one environmental group sued the EPA, said you weren't meeting your ESA obligations. The EPA fought that for years, and then they've lost. The final agreement, or the final decision around that court case happened in 2023. The preliminary agreement happened in, I think, 2021. That's why we've been talking about this for a while. Part of that is the EPA has agreed that we're going to create a plan to be in compliance with ESA obligations over a set timeline, an accelerated timeline. So this court order is in place. It has to happen. And I think that's really important. This is not a conversation about, well, if we elect the right person, can we change this? It's in place. It's a court order. It's going to happen. I think the other thing we have to acknowledge is that the EPA is not necessarily the bad guy. They are just the tool that's being used in this situation. And we need to help them come into compliance. And the reason I say that, and that may sound wrong, why do I want to help them come into a compliance? The reason I say that is because if they don't come into compliance, that leaves the pathway for the courts to pull registrations. So I would argue that the only other option, if the EPA doesn't get into compliance, is the courts will start pulling registrations and we'll start losing pesticide tools. And that's a real fear. We should be scared of that. One question I a lot of times get when I talk through this is, why hasn't the EPA been working on this for 50 years? And I would say they have. The problem is it's a complicated issue. It requires, if you're going to do it right, it requires a lot of science. So what the EPA tells us is that one product can take anywhere from 3 to 12 years to study and determine what the label should look like. Their estimates to come in compliance and review all their products is 360 years. So not even within a generation could they come in compliance using their current process. So the challenge is, they've been court ordered, they have to come into compliance. If they don't, there's a bigger threat if they don't come into compliance. The process that's science-based that they have established doesn't work. And that's what's making them, we have to rethink how we do things. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what that looks like. So first off, are any of you guys aware of how ESA has impacted your label, your pesticide use in the state to a point? Have you thought about it at all? Do you think that ESA is impacting our labels currently? My question's kind of leading, right? I got a little bit of a chuckle here, okay? Yes, it is, okay? This is dicamba, all right? The pink areas are generally what I'm referring to as endangered species counties. And there are counties where we've determined that endangered species are there, and so there are different rules about dicamba in those counties. So if you're inside or outside of that county, the rules change. We'll talk about this in a minute a little bit more, but this is also an example of Bulletin Slide 2. This is the online version of our pesticide label that we'll have to start watching in the future. Another example, and I don't know the specifics of this herbicide or this pesticide, but what I'm trying to illustrate here is there was a pesticide that the EPA even put out an announcement while Trump was in office saying, hey, no health risk, looks like it's a positive, it looks like a good tool for farmers. And then in 2022, it changed because of this Endangered Species Act stuff and forced the registrant to say, well, we just can't continue forward with this product because there's too much uncertainty in the market about whether or not we'll be able to use it, where we'll be able to use it. Burleson, you might be able to talk a little bit more about that. No? Okay. But I'm not picking on this product. I'm definitely not picking on BASF. I'm illustrating that the result of this policy has been we have less tools that we could use in the field already. And they haven't even fully gotten implemented. This is just the threat of what they're going to do has stopped policy. And BASF is not the only company that's made these decisions. Now, how many of you use Enlist? Everybody, maybe not everybody, but most of us. One of the best examples of what this is going to look like on a pesticide label is our Enlist products now. So this is your current pesticide label for Enlist. Okay, how many of you know that there's mitigation requirements on your Enlist pesticide label? For multiple years. If you applied Enlist the last 2 years, this was on your label. Don't raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. Frank, you, of course you knew. Okay, good thumbs up. What I want to highlight here is this is a great illustration. I think this was EPA's test run on what these might look like. So what this is highlighting is based on your soil, so C and D is kind of a common soil in Champaign County as an example. You either have to earn 4 or 6 credits to be able to apply Enlist on each field. So then you have to go over to this label and determine how many credits do you have. All right? So when I usually walk through this, the first thing I say is, okay, I'm on 6 credits. I'll just do 1 application of Enlist. Is that reasonable? How many people do more than 1 application of Enlist? Some people do, some people don't. No one's interacting, but I'm going to assume some of us do. But okay, fine. We can do 1 application of Enlist. That gets us 4 points. Now we need 2 more points. Okay, we put in a vegetative filter. Well, it seems kind of arbitrary, right? Because if you put in a 30-foot filter, if you're on AB, you get 2 points. If you're on a CD soil, you get 0 points, so it didn't do you any good. If you put in a 100-foot strip, you get 1 point. Sorry, my clicker's not working, right? So now I'm at 5 points. So now at this point, to get 6 points, I have to choose one of these other practices to make sure I'm in compliance before I apply the product. Okay? I think you have to think about that. And what I also want you to think about is that complexity of our management and a complexity about our record keeping. How do we prove that we did these things? Right? Some of that's already in place, but that's stuff we have to be thinking about. The other thing that I want to highlight is if you read the top of this, the land manager and applicator must effectively implement these measures. Who's the land manager? Is it the farmer? You said you, so I'll pick on you. Yeah, the farmer. Is it the landowner? Is it a land management company? Is it the trust that the land's held under? I don't know. That's one of the biggest questions with this. We don't know who's at fault. We'll dig into this a little bit more, but this is a big question. Who's at fault and who's responsible? My biggest concern is the farmer has to get the product applied, so this is going to fall on him to figure it out. Now, we're going to have allies in the industry that are going to help us, but it's going to fall on us to figure it out. Other, restrictions. So a big part of this is there's this point system and pick list, but then there's this other concept of there's just straight restrictions. You just can't do it no matter how many points you have. Some of those these are all proposed, just so we're clear, but do not irrigate within 48 hours, do not apply within 48 hours of irrigation. I don't know irrigation happens in Illinois, it's not a big thing. Out west, that's going to be a bigger issue. What I'm really concerned about is this second bullet point. Do not apply this product when the soil is saturated or at field capacity, or when a storm event likely to produce runoff from a treated area is forecasted. How do you determine that? Can you tell me? How do I know if a rain event's likely to produce runoff? I don't know. When we talk to the EPA, what they've shared to us in writing is what that probably is going to look like is if NOAA, the National Weather Organization, if NOAA says that there's a 50% chance of rain within 48 hours of the pesticide application of an amount that's likely to produce runoff. Okay, so that's helpful, right? 50% within 48 hours, but we still have that's likely to produce runoff. I don't know how to determine that. I don't know how to help you guys determine that. Because that's dependent on slope. Like if I'm on a flat surface, okay, that may never happen. But if I'm on a slope, that's going to be a lot more likely. Is that an inch of rain? Is that half an inch of rain? We don't know the answers to these questions, and that's something we have to understand. Also, I'll point out, this was pointed out to me yesterday, a lot of pesticide labels currently say that you should apply before a little bit of rain because it helps work it in. So where's the balance there? Also, I'll just challenge you as farmers, if you look at if you know you have to get a pesticide product out there, and you look at the forecast and there's a rainfall event in the next 48 hours, and you know that may be your last opportunity to get that product out there, what are you going to do? You're going to go look and see that you can't apply it and just be happy, right? No, that's not what happens. The last thing I want to talk about with this restriction space is the Bulletin's Live 2 website. And this is what I kind of call the endangered species part of our future labels. What the Bulletin's Live 2 website is it's EPA's website that basically lets them alter or update or extend the label beyond what's on the bottle. And we have a lot of concerns with this. Access. How often do I have to go look at this website? We all have cell phones now, so pop it open on our cell phone. But who's responsible for checking that? Do I have to check that every day? Every time I'm about to go out, do I need to check it? And if it's changed and I can't do what I wanted to do or what I had planned, how does that impact things? These are questions that we don't have answers to. The other thing I want to highlight here at the top. So this is the dicamba map that I showed you earlier. In 2019, there were 27 Illinois counties that had endangered species label on dicamba. The next year, in 2021, there were 18 Illinois counties. So we're moving in the right direction, so that's good. But the complexity there is the list, 14 dropped off and 5 got added. There's no transparency in understanding how that happened. Did all the endangered species from those 14 counties just decide to go to the 5 counties that didn't have it before? Were the maps not good in the first place? Do we not know what we're doing and we're just guessing? I don't know. I don't mean to sound sarcastic. This is stuff that concerns me, though. We're not basing decisions in science. We're painting with broad strokes because the agency has to take action. And we should be scared about that. So now we'll get into what is the EPA actually proposing. There's the interim ecological mitigation strategy. There's the herbicide strategy, and their vulnerable species pilot. These are the 3 documents that we've seen so far from the EPA that are giving us hints at what's to come. And I'm not going to deep dive into these. We can talk about them afterwards. I'm going to give you the 1,000-foot view. The ecological mitigation framework is the core piece of policy legislation around pesticides right now. The draft. It's a draft. And basically it says this is how we're going to move forward to come into compliance with Endangered Species Act. And we're going to do that by releasing pesticide-specific strategies. So a herbicide strategy is the first one. There will also be a fungicide or rodenticide and an insecticide strategy. We're also going to release pilot projects to look at how can we do a better job on specific species. And so we've seen an example of a strategy, and we've seen an example of a pilot project. And I just want to talk about both of those things. So in general, what is the herbicide strategy framework? I won't dive into this. What I want to hit is there's 3 main concerns. These are the 3 environmental pathways for pesticides to leave our fields: runoff, erosion, drift. Okay? Everything about the framework is about controlling runoff, erosion, and drift. What does that look like for runoff and erosion? For runoff and erosion, we're going to see something very similar to what we saw with the enlist label. We're going to have a pick list of items. Each item is going to earn us a certain amount of points. Depending on the pesticide product we want to apply, we have to choose the right pick list items to get those points. We don't know a lot. We've seen some suggested scoring on what these things might look like. The best guess, based on conversations I've had, is that most pesticide products, or most, I'll just say herbicide, most herbicide products are probably going to require 6 to 9 points. That's a guess. That's just my best guess. Any one of these items gets you either 1 to 3 points. Okay, so that right there tells you that most farmers in the state are going to have at least two of these practices on their fields, every one of their fields. Likely 3. Some people are going to have more. So what I like to stop and just kind of hover here in which of these pick list items would you put on your field if you don't already have them? And some of us are in a good position. Some of us already are doing some of these practices, or all of them, and we don't need to worry. But a lot of guys aren't. What I will tell you is the USDA and their comments to the EPA on the herbicide strategy said that the implementation of these practices by farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana would cost $5 billion. That's their estimate of how much the cost of the herbicide strategy would be to farmers. That's real money. I know in the national budget, $5 million is not a lot. $5 billion is not a lot. But to you guys, that's a lot of money, right? We need to be worried. This is serious. This is going to change how we farm. So, drift. Drift, I think we understand how drift works. If we're all being honest, we know that drift happens, right? You don't have to raise your hand and nod, but I know we all know that drift happens. What we don't fully understand, or what, that's not fair to say. What the EPA is going to do is we're going to affect things. We know what affects drift, right? Droplet size, wind speed, release height. These are going to be new limits. The biggest change that they're proposing around drift, I would argue, is expanded buffers. Either omnidirectional buffer requirements or downwind buffer requirements that are much larger. I've seen estimates, but we're probably looking at least a 100-foot downwind buffer a lot of times, up to a couple hundred feet. They'll be bigger than what we're used to. The other thing I like to highlight is it will likely be on buffers around both public and private land. So you're going to have to put buffers where you're not used to putting buffers. And we have a lot of concerns, right? Because if you have that much of your field that's not receiving the pesticides it needs, what does that do for resistance in the field or outbreak? These are things we have to think about. So I'm going to transition. That was kind of the herbicide strategy. The vulnerable species pilot. This is small. The pilot is a small-scale proposal by the EPA. And you won't think it's small scale when we look at it, but in reference to the herbicide strategy, it's small scale. What I'm scared about the vulnerable species pilot is I think that it is the EPA telling us what they're trying to get to at the end of the day, what they feel like is likely, and this is them testing the water. So they've identified 27 federally protected species that are the most susceptible to pesticides that they really have to protect, and they're going to go in and say, we're not going to just create labels around this product. We're going to restrict use of broad groups of pesticides. So this is the example the EPA gave. For example, EPA may implement a specific restriction to protect Taylor's checker spot butterfly. I don't know what it is, but we all like butterflies. You can Google it. Taylor's checker spot butterfly from all insecticides. Not some insecticides, not these specific insecticides because science has told us that they're a danger. All insecticides used within or near their range. So if you couldn't use insecticides on your ground, would that change your operation? Yes, the answer is yes. Okay. We don't have checker spot butterfly. But what we do have is rusty patch bumblebee. And one thing I'll tell you is the EPA has done a good job of explaining what all these species are. If you Google them, rusty patch bumblebee, EPA, they have a nice website about it. And the rusty patch bumblebee is actually kind of a really cool thing. Apparently, people call it the teddy bear of bees. And as bees go, it is kind of a cute bee. It's a cool thing. I'm being sincere. It's kind of cool. And I say that because I don't want them to go extinct. I don't think anyone in this room wants them to go extinct. But what I want to highlight is they picked this as a species that's susceptible to insecticides. And they've created these zones where they live. The purple area is what's called the avoidance area. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has told the EPA that these are where the rusty patch bumblebee lives, the purple areas. Now, one thing we don't understand is how did they get that map? Is that map accurate? Do you think somebody from Fish and Wildlife Service went to each of those purple dots and checked? They didn't, just in case you're curious. The avoidance zones is the purple area. The purple area, you cannot, and if you just read that language on that paragraph, I won't read it, but basically what it says is there is no pesticide use. I suspect the language is really intended to say no insecticide use, because limiting herbicide use because of that doesn't really make sense. But what it says is no use. Now, when I look at that, the yellow and green is the corn and soybean fields, and maybe it's not clear, but because I know most of you are probably not from this far north, but this is Illinois still. There's a little town right here called Chicago. Okay, that was a joke. But anyway, my point is that a lot of these purple areas don't directly overlap corn and soybean fields. Some do, but not all of them. But the real concern is there's this second piece, the minimization area. That's the area where the EPA has said that we want to minimize pesticide use, and we're going to create regulation. We're not going to say you can't use it. We're going to say we got to minimize it. And how they presented minimizing it is no pesticide applications or no insecticide applications in this case within 48 hours of a rainfall event. They suggested that you might have to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service 3 months ahead of time. And there's no clarification on what that means. What is consult with Fish and So first off, who knows where your local Fish and Wildlife Service is to call them? Nobody. I don't know. I do now because I dug into this, but nobody knows that question. And what does consult mean? Does consult mean, hey, I'm going to let you know? Or does it mean they have to give me permission to do that application 3 months ahead of time? Do I have to tell them a date that I'm going to do it? Do I have to give them a date? Wouldn't make sense. Like, let's hope it's not a date, because nobody knows 3 months ahead of time. But do I have to give them like a 2-week window that I'm going to do the application? There's no clarification on what this means. But what I want to highlight is that minimization zone is 2,600 feet from the avoidance area. So if we go back to this slide, the purple areas don't overlap with corn and soybean fields that much. If you take a half-mile radius around all those purple areas, are we getting into some corn and soybean fields in Illinois? Yes. And if we're talking about greater increased regulation on those areas, what do you think that's going to do to that farmland? It's going to make it harder to farm, right? And that close to Chicago, I would argue that it's probably going to take farmland out of production. And that's the really funny thing to me. So I talked to some farmers that would be directly impacted by this. Some of them that we figured out are actually inside the purple area. And his comment was, I wouldn't be able to farm it anymore if I couldn't use pesticides. So the result would be, I would have to sell that land. Well, if you're that close to Chicago, what's the land you're selling going to go? What's going to happen to it? It's going to be urbanization. It's going to be development. What's that going to do to the habitat? It's not going to be rusty patch bumblebee habitat anymore, I can tell you that. That's my challenge, right? We're creating policy that's defeating the purpose of the policy. Also, let's think about this. What if you do conservation on the sides of your field? Maybe you don't call it conservation, but what if you do natural areas on the sides of your field that create habitat? Are you setting yourself up to be under more restrictions because you've adopted those practices? You put in a food plot, a tree stand, something like that? I don't know. That's a real question we have to ask. Are we de-incentivizing farmers to actually do more conservation with this stuff? That's a good part. Did you have a question, Burleson? You.
Could you ever get mosquitoes in Chicago? It's not necessary.
Yeah, okay. I'm not going to. Yes. Thank you for that. They do get mosquitoes in Chicago, is my understanding. So I just want to highlight this. And also, I'm just going to highlight, what are we talking about impact-wise? There's over 1 million acres of just this habitat that's being impacted by if this proposal went into place. So I'm just going to wrap it up. I think I'm way over. Sorry, Jennifer. But what are my questions? What are my real concerns? First, who is legally responsible? Who's implementing this? We don't really know the answer to that. One thing that's been suggested is that the commercial applicator will be the person who's responsible. My struggle with that is, does it make sense to have the commercial applicator be the one to decide whether or not a field meets the requirements? I don't think that does. I think we have to think about that. What are the implications around lease agreements, absentee landowners, and trusts? We haven't navigated that. That's a complication I doubt the EPA has considered. Also think we have to think about what are the metrics around the agency, or what's the metrics for success? Is the metric for success no species ever goes extinct again? Because that's outside of our control in agriculture. Species go extinct and are damaged for other reasons besides what we do in farm fields. I think we have to step back to that, what is the motivation question? Because it's not clear to me, if we do this, if we spend $5 billion as the USDA estimated to implement these practices, there's no guarantee that that's the end of it. In fact, there's a real question we have to ask of, if we do all this, come into compliance, is the environmental groups or whoever that's pushing this on the back end just going to start another set of lawsuits? That's a question we have to be concerned about. We have to be thinking about, as Illinois Soybean as an organization, we're thinking about this right now. How do we address the legal concerns while we also help farmers come into compliance? And then I think there's also this piece of, can the state agencies actually do this? Is IDOA equipped to enforce this kind of stuff at this level? And I talk to a lot of my sister organizations, and the thing that they say is, Corey, I'm not worried because The state organization is never going to be able to enforce it, so it would just be a rule on the books that everyone ignores, right? Okay, so arguably that's what's happened for the last 2 years with Enlist, because most of us didn't know that an Enlist label was there. But my concern there is that that's not going to fly for very long, because we have highly motivated people on the other side that want these rules enforced. And so there will be push to, call out farmers, find examples of when farmers are failing, and maybe not sue farmers, but sue IDOA and say, hey, you have to enforce this. So this is something we can be concerned. We can't just dodge this. So anyway, with that, that's the end of my talk. I'm way over. Jennifer says I can't answer questions, so goodbye.
That's not true. He will have questions. Well, let's thank him first. Now, we do have time for questions, and I'll bring you the mic if you have a question for Corey.
So kind of like a devil's advocate, but I know, like I said, nobody says, oh, we want species to go extinct, but what if somebody did a study, said this rusty bumblebee, if it went extinct, there's no effect to the environment? At that point, what difference are we making? If we lose a species, nature gets, creates and gets rid of species all the time. So at that point, if we can say, hey, scientifically, there's no environmental effect, it's kind of a reverse it on themselves and say, hey, okay, you don't want to do it, but we can say if there's no effect, hey, so what?
Yeah, so I think that this is really a common question that I get, and I understand where it's coming from. I think first the important thing for us to understand in the short term, and when I say short term, I mean the next 10 years, the regulations that are in place now have nothing to do with whether or not the endangered species has an impact on the environment. They're listed, they're protected. So the EPA can't take an action that would damage their environment. So you maybe could do a push to get something delisted, though I don't think that would be profitable or, successful. I think we also have to remember that as an ag community, we maybe, some of us feel that way, but there's a broader community, right, in Illinois. We're all very aware of there's a broader community of Illinois that isn't as familiar with agriculture issues, and they are familiar with, they value the environment. They value the rusty patch bumblebee differently than we do. And we have to be respectful that we're part of that community, especially in an Illinois situation where we're in a deep blue state. We're in a deep environmental state. Agriculture is a top performer in the state, but we are not in an ag state. And I can't lie to you and tell you that. We're not in an ag state. Even though we're number one in soybeans, I'll tell you that all day, this is not an ag state when it comes to the politics and policies of the state. Maybe I'm coming on too strong when I say that, but I just think that that's the truth. There isn't a lot of pushback we can do in that space. And I would be fearful that pursuing that would do more damage because of the public image that would create. Do you want to say that Illinois farmers are against the teddy bear of the bumblebee world? I'm not going to promote that. Ron, are you going to support that initiative? Okay. Is that fair, though? Is that a fair? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And a lot of this is we have to find ways to survive, to live through it. There's just an element of that.
Yep. Any other questions?
In the session yesterday, the dinner that we had, one of the presenters talked about the enforcement process for ESA violations. Do you mind going over that real quick in case folks who weren't there could hear about it? And if you have any other comments on that enforcement process and what it might mean for upcoming ESA changes.
Yeah, sure. So for sure. So you're referring to our Illinois Soybean Grower Dinner, which if anyone's not an Illinois Soybean Grower member, I encourage you to become one. But the speaker was talking about enforcement, and I would argue that my biggest concern about enforcement is we don't know what that looks like. We do know that in all likelihood it will be IDOA who leads that, and I know that in my outreach to IDOA, they are aware of this, but they can't really do anything until the agency finalizes their decisions. And so they can prepare and think about it, but otherwise, they don't know what this looks like. I think that we, as an association, as individuals, as farmers, really need to be pushing to get further direction to our IDOA about how to handle this. I think that's something we have to talk about. And I'll caveat that with saying that, IDOA is a great supporter of farmers in Illinois, and I am a big supporter of IDOA, and I'm not criticizing them in any way, but this is going to be a serious challenge for them as well. And I think they're going to need our feedback and our support to figure out how to manage it. Some other comments on enforcement. I think it's important to understand, so the herbicide strategy gets finalized May 30th of 2024, so in 3 months or whatever that is. The rollout is going to be immediate on some things, so new pesticide labels, and then it's going to come into effect on herbicide labels as they come up for re-registration. So every time a new product comes up for re-registration, there's going to be discussion about what is the ESA label on that product. And the reason I bring that up is this is going to be we're going to have lots of opportunities to discuss this moving forward for the next several years. Lots of opportunities to give feedback to the EPA, lots of opportunities to do a lot. But that's a good question. I feel bad because I can't really answer it better because we don't know what that looks like. And I just want to be honest about that.
We'd have time for one more question.
Is the EPA, like at the tillage practices, are they wanting to find what's reduced till, mulch till, or are they going by like, I guess like a state level?
That's not totally clear, but the assumption is that they will probably go by USDA definitions or NRCS definitions. Yeah. But to be honest, that's not fully clarified in the document. And these are the things that are going to have to get worked out after the fact.
All right, let's thank Corey one more time.